Good day, everyone. This is Christy Sullivan, and I'm the Secretary of the American Society for Cellular and Computational Toxicology. Welcome to our webinar today. Thank you for joining. This webinar is presented jointly by ASCCT and the European Society for Toxicology in Vitro. I would invite you to visit our websites that you can see on your screen to learn more about both our societies and become a member to help support programs and activities like this webinar and other educational and outreach activities. Both of our societies host regular meetings and pursue other activities to promote computational and in vitro toxicology. And we also have a particular focus on supporting early career scientists and offering training and education. I wanted to mention some upcoming events. First of all, we have another webinar next month, Wednesday, March 11th, with two presentations given by early career scientists who have won awards at the annual ASCCT meeting last fall. You can register for this webinar on our website, ascctalks.org. Also, ESTIV, it's having its annual meeting coming up in June in Barcelona. You can go to this website here to find out more information. And finally, the ASCCT meeting will be in October of this year in Durham, North Carolina. And if you have any ideas or would like to be involved, please let me know. Abstract submission and more information on dates and program will be available in the next few weeks. First of all, I want to give you some just general housekeeping. This webinar is recorded, and ASCCT and ESTIV members will have access to the recording shortly after the event, and everyone will receive a copy of the slides in a PDF. Also, all of your lines are muted to cut down on background noise. After the presentation, there will be an opportunity to ask questions using the question module. So I'll ask you, even during the presentation, feel free to type your question into the question module, and once the presenter finishes, we'll be able to have a Q&A session. So our presenter today is Emilie da Silva, a PhD student at the Technical University of Denmark. Emilie has completed a dual degree in pharmacy and toxicology at the University of Paris, and then she moved to Denmark to focus on inhalation toxicity. She's very interested in alternatives to animal testing and has been working for 4 years to develop alternative methods for acute inhalation toxicity testing of chemicals. Her PhD is in partnership between the National Research Center for the Working Environment and the Technical University of Denmark. And as you can see on your screen, she's going to be presenting Moving Away from Animal Experimentation for alternatives to inhalation toxicity. And just give me one moment, and I'm going to go ahead and give her the presenter rights so she can present her talk. Okay, thank you.
Yes.
Please go ahead. I can see your slides.
Okay. Hello, everyone, and welcome to this webinar. So as Christy said, my name is Emilie da Silva, and I will talk about how we could move away from animal experimentation for acute inhalation toxicity testing. And if you don't have 40 minutes to spend with me now and listen to this webinar, I give you already the conclusions. Single new approach methodologies cannot stand alone, and the use of integrated approaches to testing and assessment, IATA, is key. I will present a newly proposed adverse outcome pathway for acute inhalation toxicity. And I will introduce an innovative cell-free method that is anchored in the mode of action for acute inhalation toxicity. You will see that we show strong correlation of this in vitro cell-free method with in vivo data. And lastly, we recommend the addition of this in vitro method to the currently proposed testing strategy for acute inhalation toxicity. If you do want to spend 40 minutes with me, then stay here. What is the current toolbox for acute inhalation toxicity testing? Currently, we have 3 OECD test guidelines, namely the test guideline 403, 436, and the most recent 433. Briefly, to assess acute inhalation toxicity, according to these 3 test guidelines, rodents, mainly rats, are exposed nose only for 4 hours to the test chemical and observed for at least 14 days after exposure. Among the 2.2 million of animals that are used in Europe annually for regulatory testing of chemicals, it is estimated that about 1,000 are subjected to acute inhalation toxicity studies. And we can underline that acute and subacute studies are among the most severe procedures for the animals. Apart from the ethical concerns of using animals for toxicological evaluation of chemicals, using animals does not come without challenges. Animal studies are costly and time-consuming. Also, the relevance of using rodents to predict the acute inhalation toxicity of a test chemical in human is debatable, since the lung physiology of rodents differs from that of humans in several ways. And these differences might impact the adverse outcome observed and make the extrapolation from animal to human difficult. Finally, this OECD test guideline that we have give no information on the mechanism of toxicity of the inhaled test chemical. The most recent test guideline, number 433, was developed to avoid the use of death as an endpoint as it is for the 2 first test guidelines. And instead, it incorporates evident clinical signs of toxicity as an endpoint on which to base the classification of the test chemical. And although this is a clear refinement of the earlier protocols, it gives no mechanistic information. And of course, the EU directive on the protection of animals used for scientific purposes is another great incentive to move away from animal experimentation. There is a lot of effort from the scientific community for the development of new approaches, new approach methodologies. However, numerous challenges need to be overcome. In the lungs, there are more than 40 types of cells, and they vary across the respiratory tree. Also, the pulmonary system is dynamic. We are constantly breathing air in and out, which leads to the continuous compression and expansion of the lungs and thereby the stretch of the cells. Thirdly, exposure via inhalation happens at the air-liquid interface, and it implies that the test chemical must be aerosolized. Finally, making the in vitro method completely animal-free is a challenge. New approach methodologies for acute inhalation toxicity testing can be roughly divided in 2 groups. The one that are based on cells and the models that are cell-free. Cell-based models can be submerged or at the air-liquid interface. And they include 1 or more cell types and many biomarkers can be tested, like cell viability, barrier integrity, or mucus secretion, for example. On the other hand, most cell-free models are non-testing methods that can help predict the toxicity of a test chemical based on their structure with QSARs, for example. And I listed the QSARs that are relevant to acute inhalation on the slide. Lastly, computational models are also key to understand the fate of the compounds in the organisms and to estimate exposure. But of course, models are models. Each has its own pros and cons, and for that reason, and because of their own specificity, they are best used in combination. And that's where integrated approaches to testing and assessment IATA are very useful. Integrated approaches to testing and assessment are a powerful tool for hazard or risk characterization. IATA gives us a framework to combine different tools like QSAR, read-across, in vitro and in vivo assays in order to answer a defined question in a specific regulatory context. The diagram here depicts the main steps of the generation of an IATA. It starts by the problem formulation, where a question regarding a particular endpoint is asked in a specific regulatory context. Then the existing information is gathered and assessed with a weight of evidence approach. If the existing information is not enough to answer the question asked, then new information needs to be generated. And in that case, we can use another tool, the Adverse Outcome Pathways, AOPs, to understand which kind of information is necessary and relevant to fill the gap. By providing information on the biological processes in play leading to a specific adverse outcome, AOPs allow to identify the relevant methods needed to fill the gaps around key mechanistic steps. Put simply, an AOP consists of a succession of key events starting from a molecular initiating event and leading to an adverse outcome, in our case, acute inhalation toxicity. In a review from 2018, more than 70 key events with relevance to toxicity following inhalation were identified. And we would like to add one more line to an already very long list of potential molecular initiating events for acute inhalation toxicity. And this is lung surfactant function inhibition. We have recently proposed the AOP 302, lung surfactant function disruption leading to acute inhalation toxicity. This AOP is included in the OECD work plan, but still under development and cannot be cited at the moment. We propose a pathway to acute inhalation toxicity that is initiated by the interaction of a substance with lung surfactant. And here is why. Lung surfactant is the first encounter for chemicals in the alveolar region. Just to make sure we all have the same base, a little bit of lung physiology. When we breathe, the air is coming down the trachea and in the branches of the lungs. These branches divide in smaller and smaller airways the deeper we go in the lungs. The deepest part of the lungs is the alveolar region, which contains about 480 million alveoli. Alveoli are small sacs of about 0.2 millimeter diameter, and they cover a large surface area of about 70 square meters, which is great because this is where the air-blood exchange is taking place. On the cross-section of the alveoli that you can see here, you can see that between the cells, alveolar type 1 cell and alveolar type 2 cells, and the airspace, there is a liquid that is called the surfactant. Lung surfactant is produced by the alveolar type 2 cells, and it's a mixture of about 90% lipids and 10% proteins. So now you can clearly see why we consider the interaction of the test chemical with lung surfactant to be our molecular initiating event, because the surfactant layer is the first barrier that the chemicals will encounter in the alveolar region. Our hypothesis is that the disruption of lung surfactant function is a good predictor for acute inhalation toxicity. I'm going to go through this AOP briefly. So in vivo, the disruption of the lung surfactant function will lead to a collapse of the alveoli. When breathing in again and with effort, the alveoli can be reopened. However, it is not without damage to the walls of the alveoli, and the loss of barrier function can in turn lead to the extravasation of blood into the lungs. And it is well known that blood components, such as albumin, will further inactivate the lung surfactant function, feeding a vicious circle. If the reopening of the alveoli is not feasible, then a reduction in the volume of the lungs will be observed. And it will lead to an impaired oxygenation of the blood, which can also lead to acute inhalation toxicity. The good news is that there exists a fast, inexpensive, and relatively simple way to evaluate the disruption of the lung surfactant function by a test chemical. And that is what I will present to you. To understand the method, we need to know first what is the main function of lung surfactant. Lung surfactant main function is to regulate the surface tension at the air-liquid interface in the alveoli. Surface tension results from the greater attraction of liquid molecules to each other rather than to the molecules in the air. Water molecules do not want to interact with air molecules, and this makes the liquid surface shrink to the minimum surface area possible. In the lungs, if the liquid surface shrinks, then the alveoli will collapse, and this is no good for breathing. So the main function of lung surfactant is to reduce the tension at the air-liquid interface in the alveoli to very low values to prevent alveolar collapse. Keep that in mind because it is key to understand the method that I will present. At the end of expiration, when the air is coming out, a well-functioning lung surfactant will reduce the surface tension to very low values, which will prevent the collapse of the alveoli and make breathing effortless. On the contrary, if the lung surfactant function is inhibited, then the surface tension at the air-liquid interface will be high and the alveoli will collapse, making breathing very difficult. We have been working for a few years on optimizing a system that allows to evaluate the function of lung surfactant during exposure to the test chemical. The so-called constrained drop surfactometer, or surfactant bioassay, is based around a drop of lung surfactant placed on top of a pedestal and exposed to the aerosolized test chemical at the air-liquid interface. To mimic the continuous expansion and compression of the alveoli during breathing, a motorized syringe pump is connected to the bottom of the pedestal and inject and remove liquid in the drop to make its surface area vary. The frequency of these expansion-compression cycles and the degree of compression are controlled to mimic human breathing patterns. As I explained before, the main function of the lung surfactant is to reduce the surface tension of in the alveoli. So we monitor surface tension as a measure of the functionality of the lung surfactant during exposure to the test chemical. Surface tension can be measured by analyzing the shape of the drop of lung surfactant. The drop of surfactant on the pedestal is subjected to two opposite forces. The gravity tends to make it flatter, while the surface tension tends to make it rounder. This means that the exact shape of the drop corresponds to a specific value of surface tension. And we use this concept in our system by taking pictures of the drop before and during the exposure to the test chemical. The analysis of the drop shape gives us the surface tension, and thereby it tells us if the lung surfactant functions well or is inhibited by the test chemical. And you can see on the animation that is not working right now, at the bottom right of the slide, when the drop is compressed, the surface tension decreases to very low values, which shows that the lung surfactant functions well. And when the drop is expanded, the surface tension increases again. And this is one cycle. You will see it on the next slide. On this slide, you can see the outcome of an entire experiment with many cycles. When the drop is compressed, the surface tension decreases to very low values, which shows that the lung surfactant functions well. And when it's expanded, the surface tension increases again. We start with a baseline where there is no test chemical in the system yet. And you can see the surface tension goes up and down. Then we expose the drop of lung surfactant to the test chemical. If the chemical inhibits lung surfactant function, then we observe a clear rise in the minimum surface tension, like on the figure on the right. And again, in vivo, a rise in the minimum surface tension will lead to the collapse of the alveoli and thereby to acute inhalation toxicity. So we have been applying this method to a variety of compounds, and I would like to go through 4 case studies with you. In the first case study, the applicability of the method was investigated using 3 inhaled asthma medicine, lactose as a negative control, and albumin as a known inhibitor of surfactant function, as I mentioned earlier. The 3 asthma medicines did not inhibit the function of lung surfactant, even at extreme high doses, and neither did lactose. However, albumin impaired surfactant function, seen as an increase in the surface tension. Although we did not perform any in vivo experiments in that case study to compare our in vitro results, these drugs have been on the market for many years, so we have great confidence that they don't cause any harm to humans. And we concluded here that the method could discriminate between safe inhaled aerosols and a known inhibitor of lung surfactant function. In the second case study, we have looked at the effects of 21 impregnation spray products on the lung surfactant function in vitro. And we compared the outcome with changes in the breathing pattern of mice exposed to the same products. in the in vivo experiments, we follow the breathing pattern of the mice. So we retrieve a lot of parameters that describe the breathing of the mice, and we choose to focus on the tidal volume, which is the volume of air that the mice will inhale, as the main biomarker. If the alveoli will collapse, there will be a decrease in the lung volume and a decrease in the tidal volume. So I will show you the results of this study. We had 21 products, and in the first group we had 6 products for which we know that we had toxicity for humans. We also had the product were toxic for the mice in vivo, and the product inhibited surfactant function in our system in vitro. So there was a correlation. In the second group of chemicals, we did not have any data in humans, but the product were toxic in vivo as well as in vitro. So there was a correlation too. In the third group, there was no toxicity for the mice and no inhibition of surfactant function. In the last group, we had 3 products for which there was no change in the breathing pattern of the mice, but there was an inhibition of the surfactant function in vitro. So in this study, we had a sensitivity of 100%. The in vitro system could detect or label as toxic all the products that induce toxicity for the mice, and a specificity of 63% because of these 3 products that were false positive. And we concluded there that there was a strong correlation between the inhibition of lung surfactant function in vitro and the respiratory response in vivo. In the third case study, we looked at biosalts, and we used 2 in vitro models to investigate their potential effects in vitro and in vivo. Biosalts can improve the systemic availability of macromolecules after inhalation by enhancing the crossing of the air-blood barrier. So we wanted to investigate their potential effects to the lungs. Lung surfactant functionality was monitored with the surfactant bioassay, and the effects on the proximal airways were studied with the mucilary cell system. We also measured the direct effects of the biosalts on the breathing pattern in mice, as I described before. And we found that the biosalts inhibited lung surfactant function, but did not affect the integrity of ciliated cells. In vivo, the biosalts aerosols induced changes in the breathing pattern of the mice indicative of pulmonary irritation. And interestingly, the ranking of the biosalts for their effect in vitro on lung surfactant function and in vivo for induction of pulmonary irritation was the same. So we concluded there that there was again a strong correlation between the inhibition of lung surfactant function and the respiratory response in vivo. In the last case study that I will present, we looked at per- and polyfluoroalkyl substances, PFAS. We investigated the effect of PFAS compounds in vitro on the lung surfactant function and on a cell model of human bronchial epithelial cells to study the inflammatory response. We found that both in vitro assays pointed to the same most potent PFAS compounds. So from these 4 case studies, the surfactant bioassay seems to be a promising alternative method for acute inhalation toxicity. And besides the further optimization of the system, it is necessary that we define its applicability domain. And to do so, we have intentionally used the surfactant bioassay with different chemical groups. We have already used the surfactant bioassay to assess the acute inhalation toxicity potential of some industrial chemicals like spray products and PFAS compounds. And we have also applied our method to pharmaceuticals, both products with the asthma medicines and single excipients with bile salts. We are currently working on adding more chemical groups to the list. We have just submitted a paper where we investigated the mechanism of acute toxicity of inhaled zinc oxide nanoparticles in vitro and in vivo. And we have current projects with cleaning products and active substances in plant protection products. In the future, we are interested in looking at cosmetic ingredients, especially the ones that are aerosolized, but also e-cigarettes and plant protection products instead of the single active substances. Because the assay is relatively cheap and easy to perform, it allows to conduct more experiments with different ingredient combinations, which is great if you want to study mixtures. We are getting close to the end of the talk, and I would like to go back to one of my first slides where I was telling you about the need for alternatives for acute inhalation toxicity. And I hope that 30 minutes later, you agree with me that the surfactant bioassay is an excellent candidate for prioritization and screening of chemicals. It will contribute to the replacement or at least reduction of rodents used for acute inhalation toxicity testing in line with the EU directive. It's a method that is less expensive, easier to perform, and faster than the animal experiment. And of course, one of the main strengths of this method is that it is anchored in the mode of action for acute inhalation toxicity. Since it is a cell-free method, it does not provide information at the cellular level, but it does respect the dynamic environment of the lungs and the exposure at the air-liquid interface, which are key elements for the prediction of acute inhalation toxicity. We are currently using lung surfactant that is coming from slaughtered pigs, so the system is not animal-free. However, with more work, we believe that it will be possible to identify the key components in play in the lung surfactant, and in the future, the method could be based on a synthetic lung surfactant to be completely animal-free. And if we go back to the current toolbox for acute inhalation toxicity testing, it is clear that the surfactant bioassay has its place among the cell-free models. I would like to finish with this decision tree that was proposed to help design integrated strategies for inhalation testing. It gives a framework for the assessment of chemicals for their potential to cause acute toxicity when inhaled. And the purpose here is not that you read all of it, you can find it in the reference, but we suggest that the surfactant bioassay, we suggest that it could be included in this decision tree as one of the methods to assess the portal of entry effects in vitro. So that is it. I thank you for your attention, and I thank everyone because, of course, I did not do all of this by myself. So I would like to thank everyone at the National Research Center for the Working Environment and at DTU, our external partners, and all the funding that we have received in order to conduct these projects. I have listed a couple of references here. that you might find interesting if you want to read more in details what is the method about and how we have been applying it. And here again, my conclusions that single new approach methodologies cannot stand alone and that we need to use integrated approaches to testing and assessment. We have presented a new adverse outcome pathway for acute inhalation toxicity, and I have presented this cell-free method anchored in the mode of action for acute inhalation toxicity that shows very strong correlation with the in vivo data. And we recommend the addition of this in vitro method to the currently proposed testing strategy for acute inhalation toxicity. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you so much, Emilie. That was a really very compelling presentation, and I hadn't seen anything about this method before, so I learned a lot. Thank you. So we have some questions coming in. Just a reminder, if you have any questions for Emilie, to please type them into the question module on the GoToWebinar control panel, and I can ask them for you. We have some compliments coming in, actually. Some very nice words about the presentation, about the structure of all of your experiments. There is one question about the second case study, where you showed the 21 materials and comparing the in vivo and animal and human information, and suggesting that maybe the false positives as compared to the mouse in vivo might not be actually false positives if you were looking at human data. Do you have any ideas?
So that's actually, I did not make that comment, and it's a very good point that, of course, when we say false positive in that case, I meant false positive against the in vivo experiments, not against human data, because we did not have human data for those products. And of course, the gold standard, or what would be best, is always to compare the in vitro model to the human data, but we don't have human data as easily.
It's an issue for lots of in vitro and other new approaches.
So we try to get human data from poison centers, for example, with accidental cases of exposure to chemicals. So that helps.
Okay. A question about whether the applicability domain. So is this method applicable to vapors and gases or only to aerosols?
So we have been looking at a range of chemicals in a study that I haven't presented here, with different physchem properties, and some of them had very high volatility. And yes, we can use the system, but then we also have to think if these vapor and gases would get to the alveoli in the first place. And then also we have to think about the dosimetry and how much of these vapor and gases will get in contact with the lung surfactant.
Okay. A couple of questions about whether it's possible to determine some sort of potency or ranking or GHS classification.
So we have in the system, there is a quartz crystal microbalance that is a very small a balance that is able to measure down to nanograms. And we have this in the system in order to have an idea of the deposited dose. And this helps us to correlate the dose with the response that we get. So there is, we have some information about the dose, but of course, it's not that easy because it depends on the physicochemical properties of the chemical that we are working with. And about GHS classes, we have some work going on now to compare the outcome of the in the in vitro assay with the GHS classes that were given to chemicals following the OECD Test Guidelines. And the idea is to see if the method is able to discriminate between the GHS classes and if at all able to recognize the different GHS classes or potencies.
Okay, great. A question about the throughput of the assay. Is it relatively quick, or and how many chemicals?
Yeah, so we can test one chemical at a time in one system, and it takes a few days from getting the chemical to having its toxicity profile. It really depends on how easy it is to handle the chemical and if it's easy to aerosolize or not. But in a few days, meaning less than a week, we know if the chemical interacts with the surfactant or not, because the assay is a real-time assay where we measure the outcome in real time.
Okay, great. Okay, question about QSAR calculations. So the question is, did you compare the results to the HLB number of the hydrophile lipophile balance? And this is a QSAR calculation based on structural alerts. Are you familiar with that?
No, I'm not sure I understood the question.
I think maybe that's one to follow up on with the questioner.
If it's was it the hydrophobicity of the chemicals, then that is coming down to the physchem properties, and we are in the same study where we look at the GHS classes, we also look at the different hydrophilicity and volatility and other parameters of the chemical and the outcome in the assay. But about the QSA, I'm not sure I understood.
I think it's a model that calculates that hydrophile lipophile balance. So it's
okay.
It's a measure of how hydrophobic or lipophilic the chemical is.
Oh, okay. Yeah, then yeah, we could definitely use this. Yes.
Yeah. Okay. There is a question about a couple of questions actually about the surfactometer. Can you model the settings to simulate a diseased lung, such as someone with asthma, or how does the lung surfactant change over the age of the donor? So I guess in general, can you vary the surfactant or vary the assay to reflect different types or different, different types of surfactant?
So the method by itself does not, let's say, depends on the surfactant that is in the system. We are still able to measure the surface tension of a drop in a system being exposed to an aerosol of a test chemical. But then are we able to change the surfactant to reflect asthma patients and COPD and elderly, or this is something that we are not doing right now. We are using this lung surfactant coming from pigs, and we do that as a model of a, let's say, healthy, normal breathing adults. There are other ways of investigating the function of lung surfactant in a more molecular biology way. And then you can look, I know that in Madrid, in Spain, they look at different surfactants also coming from neonates, for example.
Okay, great.
So it's a yes/no answer to the question.
Have you tested any surfactants or mixtures containing surfactants? So the chemical.
I didn't hear you. Can you repeat again?
Sorry, yeah, the question is, have you tested any surfactants or mixtures containing surfactants? So the materials themselves have surfactants in them.
We have tested compounds that have surface active properties, like PFAS compounds. They have surface active properties, yeah.
Yeah, okay. Okay, and one last question. Can you elaborate on a mechanism by which albumin disrupts the surfactant function?
It's not really known in details. So I wouldn't be able to give the precise mechanism of toxicity in how it inhibits lung surfactant. There are different ways of interacting with lung surfactant and inhibiting its function, depending on with which molecules in the lung surfactant the test chemical interact with. Yeah, so no, I cannot explain the mechanism of interaction of albumin with lung surfactants.
Okay, yeah, of course. So we just had one last question come in, and so I'll ask, and I think you addressed this a little bit, but what about chemicals or particles that don't reach the surfactant containing cells or don't deposit in the lungs completely due to different sizes of the particles in different areas of deposition?
So does it make sense to use the system? Is that the question?
Yeah.
Then I would say no, that this system is meant to be used to, yeah, the system tells you if the test chemical will interact with the lung surfactant. If it is known that the test chemical will not reach the alveolar region, it will not interact with the lung surfactant. It won't meet the lung surfactant. So I wouldn't think that there is any relevance in using that system in that case.
Yeah, and I think that kind of gets to your earlier point about, an integrated approach and this being one solution.
Right, yes.
Okay, great. Well, lots of compliments coming in. for your excellent presentation. So I just want to
Thank you.
thank you again. Thank you all for listening today, and I hope you consider registering for the next webinar. And Emilie Silva, thank you so much for taking the time to present with us today.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Bye-bye.